Hello, everyone, and welcome to the next edition of the webcast, Just Sales. I'm your host, Deva Rangarajan, a faculty at the IESEG School of Management in Paris. Today, I have the pleasure of having my colleague, the wonderful, talented Professor Lauren Waardenburg, who is not in sales. So that's fantastic. So she actually is going to give us a different perspective on interesting topics in sales. Lauren, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me and the audience. And tell us a little bit more about yourself. What is it that you work on? What is your areas of research? And it'll be great for us to begin.
Well, first of all, thank you for having me, Deva. I'm very happy to contribute and have a chat with you about this. And thanks for the wonderful introduction. I'm an assistant professor at the Information Systems Department, which means that I'm interested in technology and its influence on work and organization. And specifically, I'm interested in artificial intelligence and what happens when you implement artificial intelligence in organizations. What does it mean for organizational structures and specifically also for work? So how does work change because of these new technologies and when you start using them? I guess that's the short explanation.
It's fantastic, right? Because when I did my PhD a long time ago, my dissertation was at that point in time in the sales domain, but we were looking at what then was a technology. It was called Salesforce automation, right? So what is AI right now was SFA at that point in time, and it eventually became part of your CRM systems as well. And of course, it changed, right? So while the focus of my work was not the whole organization as such, but it was more from a very specific function within an organization, but it did involve changes in workplace, proper activities and processes, how we evaluate people, how it is technology is integrated into the daily activities of the firm. How do you go about rolling it out? So essentially, I'm assuming that this is also some of the things which still occupy the thoughts and research activities of young faculty even right now. Am I correct in understanding this as well?
Absolutely, very much so. And of course, these new technologies have evolved, right? So they come with new questions.
Indeed.
But in essence, it's still the same question. What happens with an organization when you implement such technologies?
Indeed. I think it's fascinating because I think one of the things you talk about AI, and we can go into what really interested me about talking to you as well, is AI is rather unique, right? Because when I talk about typical technologies, it's more along the lines of the technology does its job, you integrate it into your work. Whereas now it's almost like technology has an intelligence of its own, and it actually gives you suggestions, it interacts with you. And suddenly now you are, for lack of a better word, confronted, or you're faced with a situation where maybe the work you do could be done better, and it's actually doing what normally you would thought would have been your job. So I think it's very fascinating in that interaction and how your employees are going to perceive it, how their supervisors are going to try and manage this, and how an organization, right? Is that right? Is that something that you are also studying as well?
Absolutely. I think the point you make with, previous technologies were kind of settled before they were even implemented, right? And they just performed the task separate from the worker, and then there was some interaction. I mean, we're also interacting with our computer screen or something like that, but it's a different kind of interaction, right? It doesn't generate the new insights that these AI technologies are assumed to generate. And that's also the interesting thing. What you see now is that there's this debate about automation versus augmentation, where automation was it's kind of that was the case with the previous technologies, and it's still also linked to AI, but new to AI is also this idea of augmentation, that you can actually enhance what we are doing as workers. So definitely that's part of my research.
And actually it's a perfect segue into what got me interested talking to you. This augmentation part is almost like augmented intelligence that you provide, because I was really attracted to a paper that you had recently co-authored with your other colleagues, and we'll provide more information about the paper in the link later on. And essentially it is titled In the Land of the Blind, the One-Eyed Man is the King. Of course, how do you work? And then the exact title then is Knowledge Brokerage in the Age of Learning Algorithms. It caught my eye because around 10 years ago, there was a paper which was written in a sales journal that talked about salespeople as being knowledge brokers, right? And essentially, before I get into what they said, I want to understand the genesis of your research, what your research was about, and how did you do it, and what are some of the findings. So let's begin one. So what is the genesis of this research? Why did you try and take a look at this concept of AI algorithms and the concept of knowledge brokers?
Yeah, so what started my interest in that is really related to what we were just saying, right? The ability of these tools to generate new insights that we haven't seen before. Yeah. And the interesting thing about that is that it's already said in previous research that it's difficult to implement that within existing work structures, because people are typically distrustful of these kind of insights, because the experts, often people who have to use these are experts, and they have built up their expert knowledge, right? And then this tool comes in and generates new types of suggestions, and we just assume that people will accept it. Well, that's a bit weird. So I was interested in, how is it even possible that people will accept this and start to use it in practice? And my research context at that time was the Dutch police, who developed an AI system for predicting crime. And there is a even bigger tension maybe than normally, right? Because police officers are very, tacit, are very, I need to see things, experience things before I trust it. And there you have the tool that is mathematically based, generates predictions about what will happen to the world, to crime. It's a big tension. So I was interested in what happens if you want to implement such a system in this type of organization. How do you get these types of workers interested in working with it? Because I think that if we understand how we can, bridge that extreme tension, we can also bridge tensions in other organizations. And then I went into the organization because I'm an ethnographer, which means that you spend quite some time within the organization. For me, it was 3 years. 2 years.
Let me take it back. 3 years is what it took for you to understand. But again, I can understand, right? Because it's not that you implement a technology and people form opinions overnight. It is something where you actually see how people are introduced to it, how they respond to it initially, and that takes 3 years for you to truly understand the mechanism. Am I correct in understanding this?
Yeah, definitely. Because implementing such a tool takes time, and the changes also take time, right? It's also, in my story, it's a gradual change. So the beginning stage of the people that I studied is very different than the end stage that I come to. So indeed, that was 3 years. And I went into the organization and I asked, okay, who are involved in this tool, in this predictive policing tool? Who are working with it? And that was a specific group of people that they called intelligence officers. And I asked, what are they doing? What are they intended to do? And they were intended to translate the outputs of the AI system for the police managers so that they could use it to schedule the police officers, for example, schedule resources a week in advance. And when I heard about that and when I saw them work, I thought, it's kind of a weird group, right? These intelligence officers, they're not developers, they're not data scientists, they're also not police officers, they're kind of in the middle. So I was triggered by their role and the kind of work that they were doing, and I decided to start and follow them. And I, in the end, continued for a while.
And fantastic, because when I draw parallels to what you're saying, I'm looking at a salesperson. Forget the AI now. I'm just thinking of a salesperson and why we call them knowledge brokers, because we have the people who make your products, who talk the language of the product, who are talking about all that. The salesperson then has to take that, make sense of it. And then the equivalent of your police managers would be my customers. So essentially, how do I take knowledge in one particular format, process it, and bring it into a way which my customers can actually understand. And this is nothing to do, that's how we looked at knowledge brokerage 10 years ago. AI was not prevalent, right? So of course, the idea is that along with this, now this process that a salesperson can do can also be augmented with AI coming in, either looking at it from the viewpoint of how are your police managers, or in my case, the customers will be looking at it, and how to bring content in from the other side and bring it. Am I right in understanding how I can draw parallels in terms of the stakeholders? You're stuck in the middle, you have two sides, and you have to try to create value on both. I try to make sense and create value there as well, correct?
For sure, for sure. Interesting thing is that the brokerage literature actually also starts in the sales section, the sales department, because they are by definition these types of in-between people. And the interesting thing about brokers is that they tend to not come from any of the groups that they try to connect. So they do not come from the developer side or from the user side, but they need to have the knowledge from both. And that's kind of difficult, right?
Absolutely. And I think that's what for me, that's why it triggered a bell in terms of saying, oh, what she's doing is fantastic. But now we're getting an inside view on what is happening with the intelligence officers in this case, which in my case would be salespeople. So tell us something about what were some of the things that you found out when dealing on what these intelligence officers were doing.
Yeah, so the interesting thing is that in existing literature on brokerage, we would say, what I just said, these people are in between, they do not come from these two groups, but they understand the two groups. So they are able to interact with developers of a tool, and they are able to interact with the customers to find out what they need, right? And then if we look at the intelligence officers, it's completely logical to call them brokers and to think that they can perform that work as a broker. But there's one problem, and that is the fact that the AI systems nowadays are so difficult to understand and are so difficult to grasp. We call that black boxed, to grasp how they come to these outputs, that actually that interaction that was used to explain how brokers became knowledgeable isn't possible anymore. Even though they can still interact with the developers, even the developers cannot explain how these AI systems come to their outputs. So there's, on the one side, the intelligence officers can still talk to the police managers and find out what the police managers need, but they cannot talk anymore with that AI system. So that requires a different kind of work, a different kind of interaction. And actually that is what these brokers are not prepared for. They don't know how to do that, right? So they are faced with something that they cannot overcome. They cannot get to the explanation of outputs. And what do you do then?
I love this, right? Because the equivalent of that for me would be that you're also now talking about the intelligence officers were still doing the job before AI, correct?
Yeah.
Because I think adding another layer of complexity here is, if I have a person who says, I know what I'm doing, and in comes a black box that says what you're doing is not always correct. So you're also going to have your judgment being questioned by this, right? From a sales perspective, the equivalent of that would also be that, hey, I know about my customers, I know about this product, but now AI is going to come and say, no, you do not know so much about your customers. You might want to do something better about this. So essentially, you're having something out there that can either challenge what you're doing and your traditional beliefs, right? This is over and beyond trying to understand and making sense of how this is going to work, correct? So help me understand that, essentially, you know what I mean? So essentially, when people are confronted with the technology that says your thought processes have not always been correct, how do they react?
Yeah, so the interesting thing, what I need to clarify here, the interesting thing with the intelligence officers was that before AI, they used to be kind of low status. It's not really nice to say, but they were, because they were just the ones who were understanding the databases and where to search and where to find information for police officers and police managers. So their work wasn't really about interpreting data. They were just called by police officers, like, can you tell me who's registered to that license plate number? And then they would tell the police officer, well, it's this and this person, and these are their prior registrations. So it wasn't really a very responsible role, but they were there. Then with the incoming of AI, they became more responsible for really interpreting information or interpreting the outputs of the AI system. And there, indeed, they had this prior knowledge of the databases, of the police databases. And sometimes these systems generate predictions that are completely different from what, they thought of the patterns that they saw. And that made a disconnect for the intelligence officers. The intelligence officers had a very hard time accepting these differences, and trying to figure out where these differences came from was impossible because of the black box system. So they were kind of fighting against their own intuition, but also against the system that was unexplainable. And that didn't help the work of the intelligence officers, even so that they at some point said, well, we cannot work with this AI system. It's just not explainable. We cannot deal with predictions that we cannot make sense of.
But I think that, so essentially, so you said something which is very interesting. I really like that. So, but you said the more they learned, you said that initially when they started, they were seen as, just people I just go get information from. But what happened when you finished your research? Was it a point where the police managers, which would be the customers, in the case of my analogy with salespeople, did they start relying more and more on the intelligence officers? Because suddenly they see, wait a minute, this intelligence officer can provide us and save us a lot of time and effort and help us do our job better. Is that correct?
Yeah. That's where my title comes from. The interesting thing is, the blind ones in this case are indeed the police managers and the AI developers, because the AI developers didn't know anything of the police, and the police didn't know anything of AI development. Indeed. So these two groups were completely blind of each other. And that one-eyed person in the middle, the intelligence officers, because of that role, became more and more important, because they offered the police managers some, directions of what to do. And these police managers felt, well, this is actually quite clear. Not in the beginning, but they, evolved to find the ways to present information to the police managers in a way that police management liked it. So the police manager said, well, you are perfect for this role. We trust you completely. And they started as this super low status, not important people at all. In the end, they sat with police management at the same table, discussing the issues that the whole police department should focus on for the next week.
Fantastic. Wow. For me, this is just really, really great, because that's what we tell in sales. We say, if you reach a point where the customer relies on you for advice, and you can actually sit across the table or across Zoom, whatever is the way now, right? And if you can do that, and it's a great way for you to actually be seen as a valuable asset. But I think there's also another part of the story which I think I'm taking away, is you said you have the AI developers, right? At the end of the day, the AI developers cannot come up with better algorithms if they don't get feedback from how those algorithms are spotting trends, right? So which means the equivalent for me would be that if the salespeople are, after their interaction with their customers, if they're not bringing that information back within their own organization, your organization is not going to be able to produce services and products that can again be relevant as well. So I think from that way, this is really, really fascinating in terms of the dynamics as well, right? Now, if I pull this along, right, let me ask you this, Lauren, is that when you were looking at these people, when the people were initially frustrated, when I mean people now, I'm talking about the intelligence officers, right? When they were initially frustrated or things like that, what was the role of their management? How were they supported by their supervisors, right? Because at the end of the day, is supervisory support important? You know what I mean? Or what drives them to continue on initially, right? Afterwards, once they see some results, it's great. But how can a firm develop these knowledge brokers?
Yeah, so I think the role of the management of the intelligence officers here was very important for the intelligence officers feeling like they were becoming more important and continuing to doing their job. So the interesting thing in my story is that the intelligence officers themselves, I don't want to portray them as, you know, bad people trying to push away something and do their own thing. What they were trying to do constantly was offer the right information to police managers, or, you know, in your case, to the customers. And they were the police or the intelligence officers managers. They were constantly reinforcing them, saying like, you know what is in the police database, you know how to do this work. So try to find your best way to do this. Try to find the way that connects your expertise with the police. And if that in the end exists without the AI system, well, then the AI system is just a tool. So the management of the intelligence officers was really the underlying force for the intelligence officers becoming that, you know, department on their own. Even though a lot of them were struggling with that role, because, you know, they weren't that responsible before, and now they encountered issues where they had a say in what was going to happen or what was going to be needed in a week, and they felt that responsibility in a way that they weren't even prepared to do that. So that's a very important thing for the management of these types of brokerage roles to take into account too, right? That these brokerage roles are often, you know, not prepared for the responsibility that they have from the moment they start to do this.
Fantastic. And when they were rolling it out, did the management there also have special trainings for the people? You know, did they even have one-on-one coaching sessions, right? Because nothing. So essentially they were just put on the field and said, do it. Wow.
And that's the problem, because I did not see this role only within the police. You see it emerge in a lot of different organizations. I wrote a book on that separate from this, where you see these kind of roles in many different organizations. And the problem is that many think that if you have people who are knowledgeable of databases and the kind of information that's available in an organization, that you can then just do this kind of job, right? It's not considered as something that needs training, something that needs to be well prepared. It's just, oh, this group of people is already there, so we can use them. And it's not very strange to think that, but if you see the consequences of it over time, then it's very problematic. So for the police, they had some initial training on what is this AI system, like what can it do? You now have the predictive policing system. Good luck with it. That was kind of the training they got. And the coaching sessions, well, I guess what came closest to the coaching sessions was, you know, their one-to-one interactions with each other, where they're very frustrated about the system, but no formal coaching on how to, you know, position yourself in such a role, for example.
Lauren, to what extent, given the lack, again, as I said, I've learned a lot from Madonna the singer, where one song says the road to hell is paved with good intentions, right? The idea is that not that the management wants bad results or things like that, but essentially they're working with certain assumptions. That's it, right? Now, in the absence of a lot of help there, to what extent did the intelligence officers work with horizontal communication, right? So did they have a lot of these kind of peer networks or these peer groups that they could tap into? Say, for example, hey, hi, I have a question here, or I have this challenger. So what's that? Something that they become more of a cohesive unit, the group of intelligence officers, as a result of this?
Within the department that I studied, the group became way more cohesive because they felt like they had to solve their problems on their own. And these intelligence officers, the police in the Netherlands is spread across different departments in different cities. And what you saw was that there were these kind of communities emerging with only intelligence officers. So they were, I followed these kind of meetings as well over all these years, where they were meeting up all these different city intelligence officers were meeting up and discussing how they were, dealing with the issues that they encounter, and they all encountered the same issues.
Yeah.
Of course, there's differences between cities, but still the major issues were all the same all across the Netherlands. Yeah. And they were sharing their, experiences and tips and tricks and best practices through these more indeed horizontal communication and horizontal groups.
For me, the takeaway for me would be that if in a global or a pan-regional, right? Pan-regional would be pan-European or pan-Americas or pan-Asia, things like that. What is interesting is that what you're saying is having these peer networks is a great learning opportunity during times of change. Of course, AI is one change, but the idea is that this created, first of all, better cohesiveness. It also created more knowledge sharing across. And the key to the success of this initiative was as much that kind of an informal network that was also building up towards this. It's also how the people felt much more valuable because they're not just contributing to the police officers. They're also not just contributing to the AI developers. They're also contributing to their cohort as well. So I'm assuming that is something. The other question I have is, did you actually see the job description of intelligence officers change as it became more and more evolved? Because I'm assuming that you must have a turnover and you needed to bring new people in and stuff like that. Did you observe that as well?
Yes, I saw a change. Let me first, because I really like your suggestion of the importance of these groups. So let me I have one reflection on that, and then I answer this question. So I also think it's really important to emphasize the need of these groups and the ability for them to share their experiences. I do think that it's important as well that then the other groups are involved in this as well in any way. So either through, feedback, reports, or by just being there with a representative or a couple of representatives, because otherwise you end up with the same silos. That is, the problem that I identify in the paper is that there are all these silos. There are the developers, there are the users or the managers, and there are the intelligence officers or the brokers. And if you organize this brokerage community, I think it's super important. But it shouldn't become this siloed, like we are solving this issue together and we can do this without the others. So if you organize for something like that, make sure to involve the others as well, because otherwise they just move on separately from each other and you indeed have these one-eyed kings.
I love this, right? Because we are right now working on a paper. We're looking at, I think it's called enterprise social networks. It's the idea of using the teams, the chatter from Salesforce, and now of course Salesforce has acquired a company called Slack. And the purpose of Slack is to create cross-functional teams to work together. And I love what you're also saying here is that you should not be thinking. It's amazing for me is that we are sitting in the same university and we are working on the same areas, but of course we are thinking in different ways. But again, it's a classical way of how institutions and the way they're structured also make people work together and make it so comfortable that they don't want to go out of their comfort zone. I think the key takeaway for me here is if you truly want your the intelligence officers to actually create more value, it is in the best interest, not just for themselves, but for everyone to also have other functions also periodically represented in those meetings, or at least what is discussed in these meetings is then shared with the people so that everybody is aware of what is happening there as well. I think it's almost like these people are like, they should be like conductors. They should be able to orchestrate the kind of thing. Hey, we think this is important to you. We think this is important to you. So they're actually, from that viewpoint, I think it's really, really fascinating as well. Now to the next question I had, which was the roles and the descriptions, did they change and stuff?
Yeah, definitely it changed, because what you saw in the beginning, that there was almost no prior education necessary. So when I started, I think 2016, these intelligence officers, there were no really requirements or on the kind of education that they need.
Huh?
Later on, when I finished around 2020, their job description changed to people needing a specific previous education. So they need a specific level of education to be able to enter the role. Which also made the existing intelligence officers kind of afraid, because most of them didn't have that level of education. So they again started to doubt, like, but I don't have it. So can I then do the work, or is this now a problem? Am I, secretly being shoveled out, or So
wow, that's very interesting, right? Because now we are talking about almost department gaining its own traction.
Yeah.
You're now going to have new ways of evaluating people coming in, not evaluating, choosing criteria for people coming in, but the existing people might feel threatened. But I'm assuming that at the same time, there has to be kind of a guidance, right? Because people coming in have to learn the ropes, right? So from that viewpoint, did you also start seeing hierarchies happening? Let's say, for example, you know what I mean? More senior intelligence officers then being paired with junior intelligence officers to make sense of how it works, because at the end of the day, you also need to know how it works. AI is only one part. How do you bring the message across to the stakeholders is also another key part, right? So did you also see that happening formally, or was it informal?
Informal.
Yeah, indeed.
So what you saw, well, they had these formal distinctions, but they had them already when I came in. So when they made this role for the intelligence officers in a way related to AI, they made 3 different kind of levels. And the more senior ones were by definition involved with the ones coming in, helping them to construct the documents in a way that was most convincing. They were also often, that's interesting thing that you asked that, because they were often talking amongst each other how to sell their message as best as possible. So how to construct, for example, say they had these predictions in one of the systems on their computer, but to present it to the police, they made a very simple Word document to make the message come across more directly. And that Word document changed over time to become leaner, more direct. In the end, it became one slide where they presented their suggestions. So they made these changes on how to convince the users, the managers, of their suggestions. And that was definitely done mainly also by the seniors who were most experienced, right? It's the most logical
Absolutely.
one. But the interesting thing is that the ones who came in with the higher education, they often had different kind of approaches to the information that was in the insight generated by AI. So that was also a bit of a tension, because the higher educated people coming in, they were trying to find a niche that they could work on and really figure out the problem, while the ones that were there were already like, well, that's not really how we work. So it's
absolutely fascinating, right? And I'm sure that if you had a chance to sit there for more time, it would have been interesting to also see how this evolves as well. Because for me, especially if you have the senior intelligence officers who are not necessarily having any kind of jurisdiction or power over evaluating and stuff their junior profiles, then the question is, how will this work as against having a reporting line? Where I think it's fascinating from that viewpoint how it evolved as well. So I think this has been great. And my key takeaways from everything that you've said, Lauren, is at the end of the day, there's a lot of parallels to be drawn between your example of an intelligence officer and what salespeople do. AI is still a tool. It still needs that individual out there to make sense of the tool, look at what information is necessary, and then pass it on to both sides. Of course, a lot of times information available to them through these new tools could be quite confrontational to what they normally do. But then the key thing there is to actually learn through the process and then be relevant to all parties. It takes almost time for you to get buy-in from your salespeople for all these, for your intelligence officer salespeople for new initiatives coming up. And there's a lot of peer coaching that is going to be very, very critical. And then, of course, the activities are going to evolve, and you need to be able to manage this as an organization. Now, most academic papers end up with recommendations for the organization, right? So, what recommendations did you have as part of your research study?
Yeah, so my main recommendation would be that organizations should not view the role of a broker as kind of a band-aid to the problem of implementing AI. So it's not as if you can introduce a broker and then say, okay, now the managers on one side, my police managers, and the developers on the other side, they don't have to be involved because now we have that broker in the middle. If you view that role in that way, you will indeed end up with these one-eyed kings because the other two don't know anything about what's going on. So my main practical implication is stay involved as an organization, stay involved as a developer, try to bridge between these two. Try, as a manager, try to understand what AI systems can do, can offer to you, and what they can't, because otherwise, you're blinded by your expectations. And on the other hand, as AI developers, try to understand what's necessary from the work domain or the customer side in your case. Try to understand as AI developers what the police domain is, what it needs, and what it will accept and not. Only then you will have a healthy situation for a broker to work in, that indeed can bridge these two worlds.
Absolutely. And I think the only thing I'll add to, if I were to just paraphrase this into the sales domain, is that an organization needs to invest in its salespeople and its brokers. If they're going to be rolling out new technologies to help the salespeople, they need to understand that it's going to take time. They need to work on emphasizing how it is going to help them be better in their jobs. And also, it kind of makes sense that if a salesperson is a knowledge broker, but they connect two different entities, I will then make sure that for the so-called the product developers and other functions which are not customer facing, it might make sense for you to understand what the salespeople are saying and what they're finding out, and providing them with the necessary information that they can be relevant then to their customers, right? And similarly, it is also important for the salespeople to understand that I need to feed that information back from the customers in there. And I think, you know what I mean? So essentially from that viewpoint, I think this is what I am going to take away as key things from your work. But I think it's absolutely fascinating that people in the information systems literature are also looking at knowledge brokerage, but more as an outcome of input that is put into a system and what you can generate from it and how to use it. We can translate that for us in salespeople. I think there's two parts to this, right? One is salespeople themselves also have to adapt technology. On top of things, they also form they're connecting two different entities as well. So I think for salespeople, the level of complexity is twofold. One is adopting technology itself. The other is doing the job that they're already doing always. But there's a lot of things to be learned about at least how the impact of AI technology can be done better based on your studies as well. So, Lauren, thank you so much for your time. It's absolutely fascinating, the work that you're doing. I'm amazing that you've also written a book on this, where you also have examples from other industries as well. I think this is something that is absolutely fascinating. So thank you so much for your time and talking to me and the audience as well.
Thank you for your time, and I enjoyed being part of it.
Indeed. And you can stay tuned for more information as well. And we look forward to our next speaker in the near future as well. Thank you.